artificial intelligence will completely transform our world. But what is AI? Why will it affect you? And how can you and your business survive and thrive through the AI revolution? Welcome to AI and You. Here is your host, author, speaker, and futurist, Peter Scott.
Hello, this is episode 235. I am talking with Dwayne Wood, Associate Professor at National University of San Diego and Academic Program Director for their Educational Technology Master's Program. We are once again exploring the impact of AI on education, and because Dwayne is teaching teachers who will have to go out into the world and face that impact head-on, that makes him an immensely valuable resource for us to talk with. Last week, we talked about the relationships between teachers and students, the shifting base of fundamental skills in an AI world, the skills needed by instructional designers, how to teach effective and safe use of generative AI, and how to place the guardrails around learners using it. This week, we'll talk about the possible impact of AI on essential learning skills, the difference between technical and tactical competence, the in-person educational experience, and how Dwayne sees things changing in the next year. So let's get back into the interview with Dwayne Wood. So I want to pivot here to, here's something I worry about, that we are, at UI and actually everyone at all different ages, the last generation, the last cohort to be educated in a system that didn't have generative AI. So whatever skills we have, whatever abilities we have learned, came as a result of that not being in the process. That is no longer going to be true for everyone who is now going through the system. And obviously, I'm talking more and more about younger children. And because this is so new and we have so little data and studies on what it does to learning, how to use it in learning, I worry that some of the things that we learned how to do, some of the skills that we evolved in that process of education, we don't know how we got them. They just came along with the process because they always have. But now the use of generative AI especially could upset that, and we won't know that we lost it until it's too late. That's very nebulous, but I think it's also very valid. And I think we need urgent, immediate research that will investigate exactly this question. What's your thought?
I think you're right. One of the things, there's a model, I was thinking similar thing you were thinking about, right? I have a certain skill set, but when I reflect on it, I was like, where did I gain that skill set? Well, I didn't gain that skill set in a single event or a single course, or it was part of my experience of going through the education system or just growing up. And that's how I gained that skill. So it's like, well, right, I try to think about that. And then you're absolutely right, especially now, right? Now there's no real consensus in how we use this technology in education. So we have a whole bunch of varied inputs now that's going to produce something in the future that we don't know what it is. But the model that I'm thinking of is this idea of, it's an idea of competency. There's this conscious competency. So I know that I'm competent because of X, Y, Z, right? I know why I learned it. I can teach it. I know it. And then there's this idea of unconscious competency, right? I'm just good at it. I don't know where I learned it. I couldn't explain it to you. I'm just good at it. And I think, and we start thinking about this, is what tasks now or skills get masked? We look at somebody like, oh boy, they're in that unconscious competency, right? They can't explain why they did it, but they're just good at it. Well, maybe it's AI doing it. Again, we can kind of think about what task it is. Maybe it's an AI-specific task that AI is good at. I like to think about it as, why do we form teams as humans? We form teams as humans because we want to compensate for our weaknesses and with somebody else's strengths. And that's why diversity is a strength, right? Because we get a team together that we can compensate for each other's weaknesses and bring different perspectives. So why would we collaborate with AI? I think for the same reason. I need AI to compensate for some of my human weaknesses of not being able to crunch a lot of data, enormous data, but understand what those weaknesses are and how my strengths can compensate for AI's weaknesses. And that's what we have to kind of get to. That's kind of a fine line, right? If we think of all the probabilities, right, that goes up, that's a really fine line of this path, because either left or right is going to probably produce some kind of negative consequences that we're not looking for. Unethical use, loss of skills that we really need, or the loss of skill that we didn't know we lost, like you explained, and we don't realize it until later. This happened in my experience in the Army over the time. Land navigation. When I was taught how to navigate with a map and compass. GPS come on board. This kind of dates me, but GPS come on board and the map and compass skill, we still kind of teach it as we're in the service, but it's not as important. And then we find out that, NDT capabilities can disable GPS, but we still need to know how to navigate. So everybody knows land navigation, right? Well, as soon as they started to have people applying that skill, they figured out, we lost that skill. I think that's a real world kind of, at least in my experience, kind of what you're talking about is we didn't realize we lost that skill until we figured out that, there's going to be a requirement in the future for this skill.
And I believe you were Special Forces at one point?
I was in Special Operations Community, so I wasn't a Green Beret, but I supported the guys with the berets.
And those guys would have to know, I assume, how to function in environments where technology didn't work or had been taken away. So they would have to know how to use a map, right?
Yes, but we could talk for hours on this. The one thing that stuck with me when I was a young soldier, I had a senior leader tell me, we had this idea of being technically and tactically competent, right? I was technically competent with all the tools and things that I needed to do, but I also knew how to apply them in a tactical environment, right? That made me technically and tactically competent. And the senior leader told me, he says, don't ever consider yourself tactically and technically competent if you can't do it without technology. And that always stuck with me. Because we're talking about a different kind of environment. We're talking about, a hostile environment where you can't maybe rely on technology. So you still have to be able to perform those skills and tasks. That always stuck with me in that realm. Does that apply to our civilian world? Maybe in some sectors. If I think about the energy sector, right? Maybe I want somebody that can actually do some of those tasks without a whole bunch of technology, because if that technology fails, I still want electricity in my home.
Right.
So again, it's just like instructional design. You have to do an analysis. So I wish I could say, yes, here's the rule that we can apply across everything. It doesn't work that way, right? It's different for everywhere. It depends. We have to do that analysis.
Right. And I think people make a lot of category errors in this, in focusing on situations that are rare and blowing them up out of some kind of misconception. What I mean by that is usually talking about skills that are no longer needed to be prevalent. Someone will say, but what if you're stranded on a desert island? Then you will need to know how to collect rainwater and distill it and things like that. And my point is, well, if you really believe that, then our schools should be teaching how to make dugout canoes and coconut underwear. That is of limited use. The vast, vast majority of people are never going to find themselves stranded on a desert island. And if you're playing the odds, then you should not invest heavily in things that will advantage you in that situation, but necessarily mean that you haven't learned or studied things that will advantage you in much more likely scenarios. And the special ops people are ones that do go into that long tail of the curve scenario.
I like to think about it that we had this tool that we, for risk, how do you plan for and mitigate risk, right? And it was a scale, likelihood of it happening versus the severity.
Right.
So if something was very likely to happen, but it was still low severity, well, that's likely to happen, and maybe it's moderate. Well, I need to focus my efforts there, right? Because it's very likely. But if it's very unlikely to happen, even if it has a pretty high risk level, I'm probably not going to put my effort and my limited resources towards that. And now that I said limited resources, I think that's something I see that a lot with my students when we talk about doing instructional design, is you're never going to have every resource you need. It's just like you're going to have very limited resources, but you can still produce engaging and effective education. But as your resources become more constrained, your thinking needs to expand. So it's being able to do those things and modify processes, modify what you're doing, thinking a little bit more, but understanding the underlying to still establish and still meet those learning outcomes that you're going to meet. I tell students all the time, is like, yes, we tend to focus on that technology is going to solve everything. Some of the best education I ever did was outside scratching the dirt. because technology wasn't needed for it. And if I used technology, it might have got in the way of achieving a learning outcome. But we have to be able to have that awareness of how the things we're doing, strategies, technologies, how is it impacting student learning? Again, the sole focus of how am I producing student value? What is the student doing and how they're going to use this, what I'm doing, and what's the most effective and efficient way to do that? I tell them all the time, I might not follow Addy because it doesn't fit my context, but I modify it because I have enough knowledge and experience now that I can modify it and still get to the end state within time and budget.
Sorry, I missed that word. You might not follow what?
Addy. So that's just one instructional design methodology.
Okay.
There's hundreds, right?
All right. I'm glad you brought up that point about scratching in the dirt outside, because that's something that AI can't do. You can only interact with it through a screen and a loudspeaker and a microphone. And that ignores so many other modalities that we learn through, like in your example, the kinesthetic one. And in a cooking class, the sense of taste, and in a chemistry lab, smell, and so forth, that will, for a quite long period to come, still be things that can only be experienced in a human one-to-one, or not one-to-one, but in-person learning context. And so it seems natural to me that we should be leveraging that as much as possible in those learning contexts, because AI has pretty much got the anything you can do with a screen covered. Do you see the educational system starting to pivot in that direction, realizing this?
So I think so. And just, reading everything I can find, and trying to see what other people are doing. Again, it's so new. There's still educational institutions out there that have a complete ban on this use. And how do you enforce that? And in my mind, it's just like, when you have your teenager, when you tell them no, what are they going to do? They're going to do it. So you have to have a conversation with them. And we have to understand that this technology is not one of those fads. It's not going away. It's only going to get better and more powerful. Its capabilities are only going to improve. So we need to start understanding how we're going to apply and what it means for the future. And the CEO of Khan Academy has a book. And one of the chapters says, not only is the genie out of the bottle, but we threw away the bottle. And I think that's like a perfect way to say this, right? There's no way this is going back. Now, one of my concerns, because right now it's free, right? As long as I have an internet access, I can go find one of these tools and use it. One of my concerns in the future is it's going to become expensive to use. Now I think we start to expand the digital divide, especially within the realm of education. And I think we have to be very aware of that. I tell my students all the time in instructional design, one of the things that usually sets off a light bulb is they're like, oh yeah, I built this really high definition video that I'm going to embed in my Google Classroom, and students will watch it. We'll do like a flipped classroom and methodology. I said, that's all great. But how many of your students actually have the broadband access to play that video? That's understanding the context of your target audience, understanding their technology capabilities so that you can actually, maybe that low budget video that doesn't have the HD quality is the way to go because people have broadband access to do that. Or maybe you got to think process completely different in that, they're not going to be able to access it from home because of social economic status and all other things that may come into play. Maybe I need to make time for that within the school day. We have to think just beyond and more holistically in how we're going to do this and really truly understand that target audience and the context we're working in, which includes resources and all those things, and understand that we can't achieve everything and be able to do that prioritization like you said. And understand that. I substitute taught quite a bit when I was trying to figure out where I wanted to fall in education. And one of the things I noticed when I talked to teachers, I was like, can you tell me what's the number one thing you want the students to walk away from this whatever lesson? They had a hard time articulating it. So to me, that's already, if I can't articulate it, then what am I doing?
But that's like education 101. What are the outcomes?
Yeah, exactly. But more than just the outcome, it's what are the students doing that I'm having them do, and how is that actually meeting that outcome? In instructional design, one of the aspects that's always forgotten is the evaluation afterwards. You have to be able to say, how did I know what I did worked? You need to be able to answer that question. Because if you can't, we don't know that what we did worked. It may be having a negative impact.
Right.
This has got to be thought up front. What data am I looking at? What is that data going to tell me so that I can evaluate whatever I'm doing, if it's working or not? I find especially with educators, is there's a focus on the quantitative data. What do the numbers tell me? Yeah, that's part of the story. That usually tells you the end state, but it doesn't tell you the narrative. So qualitative data is still good data. I tell them, look, you're in the classroom every day. You're observing. You're a sensor, right? You're a data point. Write those things down so you can use that as part of your analysis to get a bigger picture of what's happening. Because again, I think a lot of education, when we talk about the cognitive aspects where I'm knowledge transmission, helping you apply information, to me, that's a small sliver. There's a whole bunch of environmental context around that that also has to be addressed. And we have a problem, I think, in our education system is that we treat it like a business and like an industry, in that we know that all our inputs that are coming in are the same. So if we do the same process, it's going to produce the same output. And I think that's a bad assumption. All the inputs we get are different. And so we have to meet the student where they're at so that we can produce that output that we're looking for. And that's hard to do.
Right.
It's easy to say.
And especially if it results in a system where you can say, look, we can produce results, but we're not going to be able to quantify them as objectively as we used to be able to.
Correct. I like to tell my students, I'm learning focused, not grade focused, right? And then I can explain why that matters, right? Look, you can resubmit assignment over and over and over because, well, I tell them, like, if you rush an assignment to get it on the deadline on Sunday, yes, on time matters, but that's not an objective of the course. The objective of the course is the learning that happens with that aspect. So if you need an additional day or two, just tell me because I want the intended learning to happen. You can rush and put that assignment together and submit it. Learning happened, but not the intended learning. I'm asked sometimes, who's your favorite student? Is that student that comes in and gets A pluses all the way time and then graduates? Or that student that comes in and struggles at the C, D, but then they get a B plus by the end of this semester? It's that B plus student.
Yeah.
They have demonstrated a change in behavior and learning and cognitive effort or whatever and met the goals. I can't say that as much as for the A plus student.
Yeah, unless they started out at a C. It's about improvement.
Correct.
Not measurement.
Yeah, exactly. So when I see grades, I'm always, okay, what does that really mean? Again, that's an end state number, but it doesn't really tell me what happened. I also like the C to B plus or D to B plus for some other reasons, because to me, that tells me about perseverance, grit. Those are some intangible skills that I think are critically important.
As long as they moved, you did something useful.
And they've been challenged and they've been tested. And I know that if I put them in a challenging situation, that they'll succeed. I don't know if that A plus student will because they haven't been challenged.
And so to return to this point about modalities, because more use of AI means more time spent looking at a screen or at very least listening to an AI spout things in a very friendly, admittedly, voice. Do you see this as at least permission, if not a direction, to do things like, let's get out of the classroom, or let's involve our bodies more, let's go outside and roll around, or whatever that involves connecting learning to like kinesthetic experiences or all the other ways in which we learn that can't be done with a screen?
Absolutely. And what I like to think about those is, again, what is the student doing? To me, that matters. If the student's just listening or reading a screen, that's not as good as if they're out actually physically doing something. And one of the things I like to, again, a lot of the courses I teach in are like asynchronous. And there might be a couple synchronous points. But one of the things I like to do all the time is I'm having the student present something to me. Because that's one of the ways that I can do that, right? I can, plus, just writing something versus presenting it uses different aspects in your brain. So if I can do both of those, where I can be fully more engaged in the actual cognitive aspect. But to your point, if I was thinking, in the K through 12 environment, especially in the STEM fields, getting out there and just doing it and seeing it, like physics and chemistry and biology, getting out there and doing it is going to have a greater impact than just having the AI tell you.
Why restrict it to K to 12?
I don't restrict it to K through 12. I just think in my environment, it's very difficult. And I'm saying it's not impossible to do. We can do this. But I may have a class of 35 and I'm in 8 different time zones. So there's a bunch of different kind of challenges that come with that modality versus when I got you in a classroom, right? And I have a little more control in how we do things. Now, granted, there are ways to do some of those things in an asynchronous environment. But it comes down to what is the content we're talking about, the discipline we're in. Some are just purely academic, right? But then I would challenge, how is a student making the connection between that?
Well, I'm going to think about it some more. It's especially obviously harder in remote learning, but even when I think about the class I'm teaching in person, going outside is not really an option. Plus, it's most likely to be raining, but getting them up out of their seats. Now I'm thinking about, what can I do with that?
I'll give you an example. I used to teach U.S. military history for the Army, and I couldn't go, right? We didn't have resources, right, to go to like battlefields and that type of stuff to kind of see that. So one of the things that I did is I took all the chairs and tables out of the room. And the room had hospital tile floors. And what I did is I made those grid squares on a map. And I basically outlined the battlefield, right? Cool. I used like masking tape and stuff and outlined the battle. And then I assigned students. The one that I did that sticks in my mind is the Battle of Antietam. We were talking about the American Civil War. And I said, okay, you're the Confederate Army, and so, you're General Lee. And I basically did that, and we positioned ourselves on the battlefields and started to go through the actual, but at points we'd be like, okay, General Hooker, why did you decide to charge the Dunker Hill, the Dunker Church? So then they have to start thinking about the things we've already talked about, right? Taking the high ground, understanding the capabilities of the weapons of the time, and understanding, the leadership challenges during that. McClellan was like a mile backwards, couldn't give guidance or didn't give guidance for reasons to General Hooker, right? I mean, so there's just all these things that you can do. And nobody sat down in that 50-minute class, right? And that meant more. Now, we didn't go outside, but we physically went through that battle and we pulled out those lessons learned at the end that could be applied as a new military leader. There's definitely ways, again, that was an in-person one, but I still think there's ways as our resources get constrained, we got to think wider. There's ways we can do it.
Yeah.
We just have to sit down and put the effort towards it and the resources towards it if we think it's important.
I love that example there. And in the way that it engages that proprioception modality, I tell school leaders, your chemistry labs should stink so that we get that extra learning. And if they don't stink, go and spill a bottle of hydrobromic acid in there so that they will. Because the labs in my high school certainly did, although that was accidental. Your example makes me want to ask a self-reflection question. How has your military background, how does that show up in the way that you teach? How do you see the effects of that coming out in you in the classroom?
So the first thing is I was a non-commissioned officer, so enlisted in the Army. And if you're a non-commissioned officer in the service, in any of the services, you're a teacher first. It's not like laid out in your job description, but that's what you are. So I have like a lot of experience and a lot of experience of failing, right? And learning from those failures because no one taught me how to teach. I had to learn as I went. But the big thing that I think makes a difference for me is the idea of mission focused. In that if I got an established learning objective, it's very easy for me to set up anything I'm going to do and align it to that objective because that's what I'm trying to achieve. And that's what you do in any of the services. You're given a mission and then you determine the steps and processes and tasks and everything that's got to happen, the training that needs to happen before it, and you go through all that process to achieve that objective. I see it varying across in education. Sometimes objectives mean a lot to folks and sometimes they don't mean anything. So for me, they mean a lot because they give me where I'm trying to go. And why I think this is important is because if you think about a lesson plan is just a plan that helps you think through what you're going to do, right? To help achieve a goal. When you get in the classroom, that plan probably goes out the window. It's just like we used to say in the Army, the plan goes to crap as soon as the bullets start flying. But if you understand the intent, the end state, the objective, you can make those adjustments to meet that situation and still achieve that objective. So to me, that's what's important. So if you can clearly state what those objectives are, and again, higher up, how is that aligned with higher objectives, organizational goals, right? So on and so forth. If I can clearly state that and clearly understand that as a teacher, instructor, facilitator, even if things don't work, I can adjust and still meet that outcome. It's why my lesson plans, when I do my lesson plans, are kind of vague. Because I like to say, I may have taught this one course 100 times, but if you ask me, this is the first time I taught it. Because my audience is different. And I have to be able to adjust what I'm doing to meet that audience where they're at. And that's one of the challenges I think in the asynchronous world is because every class I get such a diverse students that I have to be able to juggle in trying to meet everybody. And I bet you K through 12 teachers have this same challenge every year. They get to know their students, right? And they can make adjustments, of course, the school year. But I only get students for 4 to 6 weeks. It's hard to try to understand completely where they're at and make those adjustments. But that's what I try to do. And to be that flexible, again, learning focused. A lot of people don't like to hear that because I want to go from step A to step B to step C that produces this, right? Well, I'm going to produce that, but it's going to be a little messy in the middle.
That was always one of the things I had a problem with in teaching technology courses, because I would both take courses on computer languages and other things, and I would give them. And a lot of the courses I took, I saw changing quite a lot especially around the late 90s, from foundations to practice. And so you would have something which would just teach, follow these instructions, do all this, and you'll end up with something, and just do that, but not so much the thinking that would go into that. And so at the end of that, the students can say, well, yes, I built this working React application or something. Well, all they did was just follow the recipe. It's kind of like putting together modern Lego kits that have only one possible configuration and designed that way. Whereas the Lego kits, when I was a kid, were all just generic pieces that you had to figure out how to put together in whatever shape you wanted. Definitely dating myself there. But I want to get to a final question here, which I often ask guests: where do you see things going in 10 years or maybe 5 years? But in this case, I really want to know about the next year, because I think that things are pivoting so fast here that you must be engaged in a process of dynamic change as we speak. And so there's some velocity, I think, to everyone in education at the moment, their process, and if they're engaging with the impact of AI. And I'm just looking for, what does that velocity look like where you are? And maybe that's just a too fancy a way of saying, how do you think things are going to change in the next year?
I think the technology is going to rapidly change. I think academia and education is going to be slow to change, because it's very much tied to society. It's very much tied to how we've done things in the past, right? And I just think it's going to be slow to adapt.
But in your corner, where you are, how are you planning on engaging with or creating change?
So as long as I'm able to do it, as long as my academic program director says, yes, you're doing the right thing and you're going towards it, is you have to, as a teacher, instructor, facilitator, whatever name we want to use, coach, mentor, right? Any of those aspects of, you have to be able to approach this in an iterative way, in the way that what I did last time might not work. What did I learn from last time that I can adjust in the next time, and understand what changes I made and why I made those? And it's just going to be this iterative. You have to be just this iterative process. And that doesn't mean that maybe the outcome changes every time. It might still be the same learning outcome, but how I get to that outcome is different. And I think we have to be flexible in that way. This course that we talked about, that the paper was published on, I've already taught it, I forget how many times, but multiple times. I've already had to adjust, because during the first iteration, I learned that I need to be even more transparent and communicate this better, right? So I started to learn just in my own practice how I need to adjust to meet that learning outcome with these changes that are happening. I mean, we had one name of an AI tool, and by the time we did the second iteration, that name had changed already. And the capabilities of the tool had changed, right? I mean, there's new tools were out there that you have to be just this iterative and be flexible and adapt. I like to tell my instructional design students, how do you tell the difference between a novice and a master? A novice just follows a process, like you said, right? I go from step 1 to step 2. A master will adapt the process to meet their context and tell you why they did each decision and what impact that's going to have on student learning. So when you think about what you're doing, can you articulate why you're doing that? What impact is that going to have on your student learning? If you can answer that question and you answer it in a positive way, great. Let's see how it plays out. But evaluate that after it's over with. You may have to adjust the next iteration. So I think it's just being flexible and being data-driven. The idea between perceived and actual needs.
I suddenly got this image of education pivoting more to be like a Karate Kid model of wax on, wax off. So meta and experiential that the students have no idea what's going on until they realize they've become competent. That's probably an uncharacteristic extreme of where we're going, but there might be something in there that there's of use that caused me to think of that. Thank you so much for coming on the show. What would you like to tell people to find out more about what you and others are doing with respect to these questions and learn more about the kind of things we've been talking about?
There are a ton of resources out there. I say you just got to engage with those resources. But again, think critically about it. Also think about your context and have that type of reflection. But again, like you and I discussed, just doing it. Get in there and experiment it, see what it is, exploring these things. But read what you can, watch the videos. There's tons of resources out there, and start to evaluate this technology. I wish I could give much more clearer guidance, right, on, do X, Y, and Z, but there's so much out there. There's just so much. It's in my profession, and I have a hard time keeping up. So you just got to do it.
So thank you very much for giving us such a useful report from the trenches of education on this matter. So Dwayne Wood, thank you very much for coming on AI and You.
I appreciate it very much. Thank you, Peter. It was a great conversation. Thank you.
And that's the end of the interview. That Karate Kid moment near the end when I had the thought about teaching being so experiential that students don't even realize they've become competent reminds me of some of my own education many years ago when I was getting a master's certification in neuro-linguistic programming from John Grinder in person in Los Angeles. NLP, which the rest of the time would mean natural language processing on this podcast, had gotten a bad reputation in some quarters at that time due to certain people using it unethically and advertising it as the foundation of their techniques of manipulating people, which was absolutely abhorrent to John, the co-founder of NLP. So he developed what he called the new code of NLP and had the goal that when he taught it, the students would not be able to use it unethically. I have no idea how well he succeeded at that, although I haven't heard any stories that would contradict it. But I can report that when I took that course, it was so experiential that I was aware of the incredible competence that I had learned, but not how we got there. It just showed up in the process. Quite remarkable. So that's my reference point for what I was talking about. In today's news, ripped from the headlines about AI, the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission, in its 2024 report to Congress, said as their very first key recommendation that Congress should, quote, establish and fund a Manhattan Project-like program dedicated to racing to and acquiring an artificial general intelligence, AGI, capability, and went on to say that such a capability would, quote, usurp the sharpest human minds at every task, end quote. Obviously, it's too soon to say whether Congress will do anything of the sort, and I'll remind you of the scale of funding of the Manhattan Project and some rather prominent statements about reducing government spending that are being bandied about by, notably, Elon Musk. But this is worth pointing out, particularly as it would likely fall under the defense budget. It also heavily suggests that any calls for slowing our progress towards AGI are quite likely to be ignored. Next week, I will be talking with Alexandra Belias, Head of Product Policy and Partnerships at Google DeepMind, about AI's role in science, among other topics. That's next week on AI and You. Until then, remember, no matter how much computers learn how to do, it's how we come together as humans that matters.
That's all for this episode of AI and You. Please leave a rating and comment and share with your friends. Get the book Artificial Intelligence and You and see more videos and articles at aiandyou.net. That's aiandyou.net, where you can also send us your questions. Thank you for listening.